Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video lecture, we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle, which is another one of the biogeochemical cycles that is discussed in Module 7 of your textbook. Again, I recommend that you check out this part of your textbook because it does a good job of adding in some extra detail and making some connections between the cycles. Now remember, energy flows through the trophic levels and is eventually lost as heat to the environment. Energy does not cycle in a biogeochemical cycle. Instead, matter, or everything other than energy, is cycled using these biogeochemical cycles. And there are 4 types: water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And in this video, we are only really looking at the nitrogen cycle. So some key pieces to remember that should be reviewed for you from past science classes is that the atmosphere, or the air that you are breathing, is not mostly oxygen. In fact, it is primarily, or 78% of that air is actually nitrogen gas. So N2, 2 atoms of nitrogen bonded together. Now, this nitrogen gas is not actually able to be used by living things. Instead, that nitrogen gas has to be converted into a different form, and that conversion takes place through nitrogen fixation. I also want you to keep in mind that the nitrogen cycle is a super fast process. Most of these reservoirs, or spots within the cycle that the nitrogen kind of hangs out for a little bit, they only hold the nitrogen for a relatively short period of time. And when I'm talking about relative periods of time, I hope you remember that if you think back to things like the carbon cycle, during sedimentation, that carbon staying as a sedimentary rock for thousands of years. The nitrogen cycle doesn't have any of that. The nitrogen cycle moves pretty quickly. In fact, the longest period of time, or the biggest reservoir, would be the atmosphere, where the gas is kind of hanging out, but is relatively quickly converted and used in something else. I also want you to keep in mind that the nitrogen cycle is talking about a limiting nutrient. So nitrogen, even though it is abundant in the atmosphere, it's not able to be used by organisms, and organisms really require nitrogen in order to do daily life processes. If you think back to your biology classes and you think back to the macromolecules, many of those macromolecules, particularly your DNA, has nitrogen in those bonds. So your DNA and those proteins in your body, they really need nitrogen to help form that backbone. There are many key processes to the nitrogen cycle, but there's only one that you really need to know, and that is nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the process that converts atmospheric nitrogen into a form that can actually be used by producers, which would be plants. Nitrogen fixation can be done in a biotic or an abiotic process. The biotic process is done by bacteria, and it converts that N2 gas into NH3, which is ammonia. Abiotic fixation, this is done by bolts of lightning, which is pretty crazy. It also happens when humans do artificial fertilizer production. Basically, they're making artificial lightning that does this chemical process. And that creates a slightly different form of nitrogen. It creates ammonium, or NH4+. Either way, both of these forms are actually usable by organisms, such as producers. Now, there are many other processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. Remember, these are fast processes. They don't take an extremely long period of time. There's nitrification, assimilation, mineralization, which is also called ammonification, and denitrification. Do not panic. You do not need to know the nitty-gritty chemical stuff that's happening inside each of these processes. The only one out of these lists that I think is kind of important would be assimilation, because that word shows up in some of the other cycles and throughout this course. Assimilation is the process that happens when an organism takes the nutrients that it consumes, or in producers they're absorbing through their roots, and it converts them into their body tissues. So that's assimilation. Denitrification is kind of the opposite of nitrogen fixation. Denitrification is the other process that I think you might want to pick up on a little bit, and that's the process that turns that nitrogen back into nitrogen gas. Otherwise, I don't think you need to really linger too much on these terms. Many years ago, there was an AP exam question that asked students to write out the chemical formulas on this, but since then, that type of question's really been phased out. So as long as you understand the overall concept of the nitrogen cycle, you should be okay. If they would ask a question like that, really they're just trying to separate out the students that earned a 5 on the exam from the 4. It shouldn't affect your overall pass rate. You should just be fine. When we look at a diagram of the nitrogen cycle, again, the key processes that I think you really need to pay attention to is nitrogen fixation. College Board specifically pulls that out and says you need to know it. So I'm telling you now, you need to know it. And that's converting the abundant N2 nitrogen gas into a form that can be used by producers, which are plants. Once that nitrogen is in plant tissues, animals or consumers can come along, eat those plants, and assimilate or convert that nitrogen into their own tissues. Those are kind of the two processes that you really need to know. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the processes and the products, you can use the acronym FIXNAD and PAN. Honestly, I don't think you really need to know this, so I'm just going to put it here. If this is something that you really want to dive into, again, this is kind of that extra credit, extra step level of understanding, but in general, I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this. What you do need to know is how humans are impacting the nitrogen cycle. Now remember, nitrogen is normally a limiting nutrient. So that means that it limits plant growth and it limits the amount of productivity in a particular ecosystem. So what that means is if there's extra nitrogen, suddenly these plants can grow a whole bunch. The only way to really have excess nitrogen being suddenly added to an ecosystem would be from synthetic or organic fertilizers. So having too much fertilizer in an area, or if it runs off from the intended area to a different location, that can lead to what's called eutrophication. So back in the aquatic biome video, we talked a little bit about eutrophic lakes. Eutrophication is the process that leads to this body of water that has a huge amount of plant life in it. But eutrophication can also be a bad thing. So if you have a sudden increase in nutrients in an aquatic environment, that means that the plants that live there can start going crazy and start growing. But eventually, especially if that nutrients and that nitrogen is from fertilizer, that fertilizer is not going to keep coming constantly. So now these plants that grew a whole bunch, they no longer have more of that fertilizer helping them to keep growing. So then they kind of starve and they die. And that algae bloom, when that starts to die, that means you're going to have more microbes there to decompose and break down the algae. And as those microbes are doing that decomposition, they are consuming a lot of the dissolved oxygen in the water. So in the process of decomposition, you take in oxygen and you release carbon dioxide. Well, the problem is when you do not have very much oxygen remaining in that waterway, other organisms, particularly small macroinvertebrates and fishes, they are not able to survive. So we start seeing a die-off of all sorts of other organisms. Now this is pretty bad. So we have extra nutrients. That means there's a whole bunch of plant growth, but then those nutrients go away, so the plants die. Plants are decomposed, which uses all of the dissolved oxygen, which means everything else in the water is going to die. So eutrophication can be super duper bad when humans start messing around with the nitrogen cycle. So in summary, your atmosphere is made primarily of nitrogen gas. And this nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is not able to be used, and it needs to be converted by doing nitrogen fixation. The nitrogen cycle is a relatively fast process compared to the other cycles, and most of those reservoirs hold nitrogen for a pretty short period of time. Also, make sure you remember that nitrogen is a limiting nutrient, and excess nitrogen can lead to the process of eutrophication, which is super bad. You don't want to do that. Again, I know this was a lot of information. I went pretty quickly. Please leave your questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, feedback, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope that you really took some good notes and that you learned something as you watched this.